Terrorism, Protection of Premises Bill, second reading.
Now.
Minister to move second reading. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this bill be read a second time. It is a bill which has the wholehearted support of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and I hope the whole House. It is a bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, where some of those who have campaigned hardest for it are joining us in Parliament for these debates this afternoon. Madam Deputy Speaker, 7.5 years ago, on the evening of the 22nd of May 2017, thousands of people went to Manchester Arena for a music concert. Many of those in attendance were children and teenagers, there to see Ariana Grande, to see their favourite pop star, and to dance and sing along to her songs, to soak up the atmosphere with friends, family. But as the event drew to a close and people started to leave, terror struck. Scenes of happiness gave way to shock and to trauma, and an enjoyable spring evening was transformed into a nightmare. More than 1,000 people were injured. 22 of them never came home, and 9 of those were teenagers. Today we remember them all, their lives brutally cut short in an act of pure evil. And we think of the victims of other terrorist attacks too. They will never be forgotten. Their families and friends left to pick up the pieces and somehow to go on are in our hearts and our prayers. And we think of all those who survived this and other similarly abhorrent attacks and who live with the scars, whether physical or psychological, the survivors of all terror attacks. We think of the first responders who, when the worst happens, are on the front line, bravely working to protect the police, to protect the public and to save lives. And we think of the police and security and intelligence agencies who work night and day to prevent attacks and keep us all safe. And we give them our thanks. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the aftermath of the Manchester Arena attack, our country did what it has always done when confronted with terrorism. We came together. As the city grieved, we stood shoulder to shoulder with those affected. We offered our friendship and support. And in the darkness came rays of light, those who was determined to support each other and to make sure that more was done to save young lives in the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, that spirit is embodied by Figan Murray. Figan is with us in the gallery today, and it's because of Figan that all of us are here to talk about this legislation. Figan's son, Martin Hepp, was among those killed in the attack, and I cannot imagine Figan's pain, and I am in awe of her courage. To suffer such a horrendous loss and somehow find the strength to fight for changes that will help others is heroic. And despite her grief, she has campaigned. And she said this morning, when asked why she does this, that she looks at her child's ashes on the bookshelf. And she doesn't want other families to have to face the same. So yes, she and campaigners have fought for this law. This bill has been a long time coming, and she has never given up. And I'm sure the whole House will agree when I say to Figan, you are a true inspiration. Yeah. Officially, we are debating the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, but in essence and in spirit, this is Martin's law. Madam Deputy Speaker, the first responsibility of any government is to keep the public safe. That is and will always be our number one priority, and we will not let terrorists and extremists destroy or distort our way of life. It's why we're committed in our manifesto to strengthen the security of public events and venues. It's why the Prime Minister has made a personal commitment to Figan Murray, and why we've moved at speed to introduce the bill in a matter of weeks after the general election. Earlier work was done on this bill under the last government, and I'm glad to say that it has cross-party support. And when it comes to security matters, I hope that the House will always be prepared to come together. The Manchester Arena Inquiry made 169 public recommendations. In Volume 1, they focused on the security of the arena and set out the need for a protect duty in primary legislation. The Chair, Sir John Saunders, who I thank for all the work that he did, concluded, "Doing nothing is, in my view, not an option. Equally, the protect duty must not be so prescriptive as to prevent people enjoying a normal life." And that encapsulates the purpose behind the bill, and indeed the purpose behind so much of what we do when countering terrorism and extremism. How to ensure proper measures are taken to keep us safe, and how to make sure people can get on with their lives. That we make it possible for people to keep enjoying all the things they do. Protection of life, protection of our way of life. Since March 2017, the MI5 and the police have together disrupted 43 late-stage plots. There have been 15 domestic terror attacks. And we know from these incidents the public can be targeted at a wide range of public venues and spaces. We know too the terror threat has become less predictable, potential attacks harder to detect and investigate, which is why everyone needs to be part of the measures we take to keep people safe, including those who run the premises and events, to know what they can do, what they should be doing to keep people safe. I will give way.
We can be, and I'm loath to interrupt her because she's making a very passionate and clear case about why this bill is necessary, and we will be supporting her this evening. But is she aware of the concerns from the live music sector, who will bear the most burden and be most impacted by this particular bill? Is she in constant contact with the live music sector, and can she offer any reassurance to the number of issues that I know that they have raised with her?
The Honourable Member makes an important point, and I know there will be many detailed discussions at committee stage on this, but one of the things we have sought to do since the original draft legislation was published was to ensure that there was extensive consultation with businesses, with premises and with venues of all sizes. It's why there is a different approach that I will come on to, a different approach for different size of venues, and also for ensuring that the response that premises need to take is proportionate and does recognise the detailed individual circumstances, which will be very different from one venue and one organisation to another. So I will come on to that point and that detail. So the legislation requires for the first time that those responsible for certain premises and events consider the terrorist risk and how they would respond to an attack. Larger premises and events will need to take steps to reduce their vulnerability to terrorist attacks. For premises to be in the scope of the bill, it must be reasonable to expect that there may be 200 or more individuals present on those premises at the same time, and the premises must be used for one of them or more of the activities that are specified in the bill, for example, for entertainment or leisure. For those that are in scope, a tiered approach has been established with requirements varying. Events and premises where it's reasonably expected that 800 or more people may be present at once will generally be in the enhanced tier, and any other premises, those for the 200 to 800 may be present, will be in the standard tier. For those responsible in the standard tier, they'll be required to notify the regulator and have in place public protection procedures to reduce the risk of harm to individuals in the event of terrorism. But it's really important that those procedures are designed to be very simple and low cost, and there will be no requirement to put in place physical measures in the standard tier. There's 4 categories of procedure: evacuation, if you need to get people out of a premises; evacuation, for example, if you need to keep people safe within the premises; lockdown, if a premises needs to be kept secure for an attacker who is trying to get in; and communication, simply communicating to all those involved, to staff and to those, the public, who might be at risk. And in recognition of the potentially greater impact of an attack on the larger premises, those in the enhanced tier will have further requirements. Public protection measures. First, monitoring for risks and for indicators. Second, security measures for individuals. That might be the search and screening processes. Thirdly, some physical safety measures where relevant, for example, around safety glass. And fourthly, again, securing information to make it harder for people to plan for or prepare or execute acts of terrorism. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary for giving way. May I just ask her, given that the atrocity in the Manchester arena was caused by a terrorist coming in with explosives in a very prominent backpack, how would the measures that are being proposed have affected that scenario?
So we are being clear that it is not for the government to specify precise arrangements for every venue, and I don't think that would be appropriate to do so. So it will vary according to the event. We know that many large venues already have procedures to be able to search bags or to be able to have those sorts of checks in place. But we are very clear this needs to be done proportionately and needs to be done according to the size of the venue and according to the arrangements and things that are take place.
Just pursue it a little further and say that if what we're really talking about is explosions being carried out by suicide bombers amongst large numbers of people, the one thing that all those atrocities have in common is that an explosive device, which is invariably bulky, has to be carried in. So isn't this the central point that everybody ought to be addressing?
The Honourable Member is right, and that's why one of the things that we would expect is to have proper search measures, particularly to ensure that there are measures around the security measures around the movement of individuals, but as well as the issues around what might be the searches that take place on an event itself, it may also be about having monitoring procedures in place. If that same individual has been back and circling a venue several times and is behaving in a suspicious or inappropriate way, then making sure that staff are trained to be able to recognise those kinds of risks and indicators may also be an important part of keeping a venue safe. I will first of all give way to my honourable friend, and then I will come back to the honourable member.
I thank the Home Secretary for bringing forward this really important legislation, which means so much to those affected in Manchester, but also those who were affected on the 3rd of June 2017 London Bridge and Borough Market attack. And this issue of measuring risks and taking measures in advance to try and protect people is where I have a question. Will venues be able to draw down on terror insurance where they have it? Will the government be supporting an awareness campaign of the need to have terror insurance and support? And where those risk assessments highlight a physical barrier or a change to an external area, how will this bill support venues and local authorities to work together to resolve concerns? Because one of the barriers to securing literally, around Borough Market has been the design, who's going to pay. There's been lots of practical difficulties in designing and installing the permanent barriers to protect all those who still use such an amazing venue in Borough Market in my constituency.
Well, I thank honourable friend for his question, and as he will know, the Prevention of Future Deaths report from the London Bridge and Borough Market inquests had called for clarity of responsibility for venue operators regarding protective security, and that is one of the reasons that we are bringing forward this legislation, is to address that. He is also right, of course, in practice, security measures and safety measures do require people to work together and do require partnerships between those in the venue and also local councils and others as well. In terms of the approach taken by insurance companies, it's not for this legislation to set out the decisions for insurance companies. However, the whole purpose of this legislation is in order to make venues safer and in order to make them more resilient to the kinds of pressures and the kinds of attacks that they might face. And I just say I would give way to the honourable member, and then I would give way to the honourable member.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for giving way. She makes two profoundly important points. The first about the metamorphosis of terrorism and how we need to be persistently clear about how we respond to it in the event of those changes. And the second about how the whole House comes together on these matters. As she knows, I've had an interest in this for some time, and I entirely endorse what she said. The particular point I wanted to make was about anticipating events. So she's spoken a great deal about how you deal with events in the moment, as it were. Training of staff is critically important, as she said. But of course, we could be talking here about a time device, something that's planted long before a large event takes place. And with these very large events, these events which are scheduled well in advance, how does she see this legislation impacting on a plot that's made well in advance, as I'm sure the one in Manchester was?
The honourable member makes an important point, and I thank him for his long-standing interest in this issue. So those responsible for premises and events in the enhanced tier will be required to provide the regulator with a document which sets out all of those public protection measures and procedures that they have and how they expect those to reduce their vulnerability and risk of harm from terrorism. The first of those categories is about the monitoring for risks and indicators, but that may be about the monitoring around prevention measures. So, for example, if there has been some kind of security breach a week before or some days before, or what those risks might be as well. Some of those will also be about the third measure is about physical safety measures. So again, that might be around what are the physical arrangements that can prevent somebody being able to take action in advance of a major event and somehow create the risk and threat in advance, and that there are ways of having those checks in place. And what the bill does is ensure that there is a new regulator to oversee compliance through a new function of the Security Industry Authority. We do expect the SIA's primary role to be supporting and advising businesses to implement the legislation's requirements. So whilst the SIA will have a suite of powers and sanctions, including the power to issue fines for non-compliance or to shut down events in the enhanced tier, in fact, those sanctions are primarily civil. And I want to reassure the House that those responsible for premises and events will be given time to understand, and that the approach that the SIA takes will be to support venues to be able to adopt these new measures, and a range of factors will be taken into account so that penalties would only be used to address the most serious failings or repeated failings. I give way to the honourable member.
Can I thank the Secretary very much for her contribution today and for setting the scene so very well. Obviously, we will support government legislation coming forward because it's the right thing to do, and that's why we will do it. Obviously, the Secretary of State knows very well that we in Northern Ireland have suffered a 30+ years campaign by the IRA where shopkeepers and those involved in businesses took steps against fire bombs, against people brought bombs to the house, take car bombs as well. It all resulted in a large loss of life. Has there been an opportunity, Secretary of State, to consider what was done in Northern Ireland to combat these things in a voluntary capacity, ever mindful it wasn't perhaps necessary to have any legislation that handed out fines and so on, because I think everybody wants to do the right thing, and if we want to do the right thing, that's how we encourage people to do that. But lessons can't be learned from back home. I'll speak later, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll highlight some of those things, but just I think it's important that we do take all the knowledge everywhere in the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland together. Thank you so much.
Well, the honourable member is right that there has been considerable work by many venues, premises in Northern Ireland to respond to the kinds of threats and risks that sadly communities have faced through the years. What he may also be interested to know is that in Manchester, they introduced a voluntary version of Martin's Law after the appalling Manchester Arena attack, providing training and support for venues that many businesses were keen to sign up to, and that has been very well supported, and the view in Manchester is that that has been hugely successful. Of course, his experience in Northern Ireland and the experience in Manchester is that too often there has been a tragic reason why organisations have responded in that way and done so. But what we need to make sure is that those same lessons are learnt right across the country, and that's why we're setting out this comprehensive legislation, so that we're not in a situation where the biggest venues only respond when something terrible happens and when it's too late and lives have been lost. So we are committed to working extensively with the business community during the passage and the rollout of the bill. And as well as that ongoing programme of direct engagement, we've also updated Protect UK to make it easier for businesses and others to navigate and understand the supporting information on the bill. We're acutely conscious about bringing forward this legislation, about the need to get the proper balance and detail right. And that is why Honourable and Right Honourable members will know that the bill's proposals have been subject to extensive development, and that the draft version of the legislation was subject to pre-legislative scrutiny under the previous government. Most crucially, we have raised the threshold for being in scope from 100 to 200 individuals. We also recognise the need for a location-specific approach, because the procedures in one place may not apply to another. And we've also ensured that in both tiers, appropriate procedures and measures are required only insofar as reasonably practical. And I think those words are crucial to recognising the importance of, again, protecting life and also protecting our way of life as well. With Fegan here, we always keep in our minds that terrible day in Manchester 7.5 years ago. The youngest victim was an 8-year-old girl, Safi Rose Roussos. And her teacher, head teacher, asked the question afterwards: how do you tell 276 children that their friend has been murdered? And that's a question we all ask. How to explain how anyone could have targeted the event that day, young children enjoying their love of music and dancing. But that is the point. When terrorists want to cause maximum damage, when they want to destroy our way of life, of course they seek out crowds, but they also seek out innocence, happiness, and joy. And that's why our task is not just to take the measures to keep people safe, but to work tirelessly to ensure people can get on with their lives, they can get on and enjoy their lives, that we never let terrorists, extremists, and criminals win. So let me finish by quoting Fegan. She said, "It's time to get this done." I couldn't put it better, Madam Deputy Speaker. With that, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I express my thanks to the Home Secretary for bringing this bill forward with such pace and alacrity. But also, can I take this opportunity to pay tribute to Fegan Murray for her tireless campaigning, and I know she and her husband and other campaigners join us in the chamber today. And of course, it's also appropriate that we pay tribute to her son, Martin Head, who was murdered whilst going to the Manchester Arena in 2017 to watch a concert. Murdered alongside 21 other innocent victims. And it is, of course, in that tragic context that we find ourselves in the House today considering this legislation. As the Home Secretary has said, this legislation enjoys cross-party support, and of course from the opposition benches we are supportive of the aims and aspirations of this bill, and I'm grateful to her for recognising at the dispatch box the work that was done, particularly in pre-legislative scrutiny, to make sure that this bill has the best chance of navigating through its parliamentary stages and being concluded in a manner which achieves the dual purpose of keeping people safe whilst also supporting the music and entertainment industry of which we are so proud. When I met Ms Murray ahead of the general election, I said, perhaps rashly, that I was confident that irrespective of the outcome of the forthcoming general election, that this bill would be brought forward. I'm very glad that the Home Secretary did not put me in an awkward position having made such a commitment, but I felt confident at the time I would be proven right, and indeed she and her ministers have proven me right, and I'm very pleased on that one occasion thus far she has done so. Martin's Law was in both our parties' manifesto at last general election, and it is important that this measured and well thought through, and I'm sure properly scrutinised piece of legislation makes it through the House, because, as she says, the threat picture is complex, it is evolving, and it is enduring. And terrorists choose to attack a broad range of locations. And as the Home Secretary states, they choose to attack in a manner and in locations which maximise the detrimental impact on our way of life. And the protection of our way of life is, I suppose, in many ways just as important as protection of life itself. And because of the range of potential targets, it is right that the bill proposes a range of premises to be better protected and be ready to respond in the event of a terrorist attack. Whilst at the same time, the government has to think very carefully when regulating in this way to make sure that we recognise you cannot regulate away all risks, and that we should regulate when and where it provides greater safety to the public, but ensuring that we don't create a false sense of security or impose a cost so high that venues are unable to comply and therefore fail to reduce the risk. And it's therefore, I think, appropriate that we look at the impact assessment produced by the government and recognise that the new regulations will affect an estimated 155,000 small businesses with venue capacity between 200 and 799 people, and that will impose an average cost upon them of around £330 a year. And the regulations will also impact around 24,000 larger venues with a capacity of 800 and above, with an average cost of around £5,000 a year. When I was Home Secretary, I looked at ways of reducing as much as possible the burden on the industry, and whilst doing so, ensuring that those with the broader shoulders, as it were able to bear the largest load, whilst protecting the smaller venues. And I therefore welcome the lighter touch approach that has been put forward, particularly in the standard tier. Again, whilst in government, we also looked at the case to raise the standard threshold beyond 200 to around 300. And I can see that in the proposals put forward, 200 was the capacity that was settled upon. Now, clearly, as the bill goes through its scrutiny process, questions will be asked about whether 200 or 300 or lower or higher is the appropriate figure. And it is right that those questions are asked, and members across the House should feel at liberty to probe the government on the thinking and rationale, because this is about balance. It is about making sure that people are safe, but also making sure that venues stay viable. And so, in recognition of the important but novel approach that is being taken, what thought has the government given to a feedback process whereby the implementation can be assessed and thresholds adjusted if needs be? And so the government may consider implementing the enhanced tier in a staged process, learn lessons before implementing fully in the standard tier. And certainly I would be more than happy to discuss this with her across the dispatch box, in committee, or indeed elsewhere. Turning to the establishment of the new regulator, I welcome the government's intention that the regulatory functions of Martin's Law will be delivered as a new function of the Security Industry Authority. But what assurances has the Right Honourable Lady had from the SIA regarding their readiness for this? Because, as I said, including the standard tier venues, we are looking at nearly 200,000 venues. And we want to make sure that this legislation is effective and not just on the statute books gathering dust.
I wonder if my right I'm extremely grateful to my Ron for giving away, and I'm mindful of his last point and the early one he made about how smaller businesses can cope with these new requirements. It seems to me part of that is about increasing on the part of their staff awareness and understanding of the threat, and the training that the Home Secretary spoke about will be vital in that respect. I wonder if my honourable friend might agree that one of the ways of minimising the cost will be for those umbrella organisations to coordinate some of that training in organisations big and small to improve staff understanding of risk and how it can be countered.
My right honourable friend makes an important point, and with so much of legislation of this nature that enjoys cross-party support, there are opportunities to discuss the most effective way of implementing what is a universal desire to get good and effective but not overly onerous legislation on the books. And I think sometimes members can feel a bit reticent asking challenging questions for fear that it comes across as seeking to undermine the work of legislation. And I know in conversations that he and I have had that that is absolutely the opposite. But there are opportunities, for example, where the requirement of the enhanced tier venues to get their house in order could be done in close coordination with local venues in the standard tier, whereby training that is done hand in hand without the full burden, financial, time or otherwise, falling on some of those smaller venues. And it's that kind of detail which I think could turn what is a fundamentally sound bill into something that is both sound and increasingly effective. And of course, we also need to look at what else can be done to ensure that the plans for premises cannot be used against them. So ensuring that if those plans are disclosed, that they are not utilised by would-be attackers as part of their preparation. And of course, there is a balancing act between having best practice made public, something which would benefit smaller venues, whilst ensuring that we are not giving advantage to those that would do them harm. And also I'd ask the ministers ensure that the regulator is supportive and constructive. It is a point that she made, saying that the dispatch box is important, making sure it's really embedded in the organisation is key, because their desire should be to help venues stay safe and viable rather than look for opportunities to rush in with fining powers, which could either put businesses out of business or introduce such a fear of fine that they decide to take the easy option and close their doors, which is not something that either side of the House would wish to see. Organisations will, of course, need time to adapt and familiarise themselves with the new guidance. And on that point, I note that the new legislation is unlikely to be implemented for around 24 months after royal assent is put forward. If this is the case, and in this period, will the Right Honourable Lady give a commitment to engage with the industry via the Federation of Small Business, Live, the GLA and other bodies to ensure that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach which might inadvertently perhaps squeeze sensible changes which could increase compliance but without increasing risk? And also, what mitigations or exemptions will she consider to protect voluntary and community venues, churches, places of worship, particularly those who have already said that the new regulations will be burdensome for them? Because it's vital that we keep thresholds and guidance under review as the legislation is implemented. Fear of regulation often incentivises owners and organisers to take the most cautious point of view rather than the most appropriate point of view, and that would be counterproductive. As you said, the terror threats are constantly evolving, and we must evolve with them. But in doing so, we must also be alive to the threat that new regulations and protections have on our everyday lives, on gatherings, on places of worship and on business. And we should make sure that we keep proportionality in the forefront of our minds. She has made a commitment to do that. I'm grateful that she has. And in that spirit, I would like to offer the support of the opposition benches in ensuring that this legislation passes promptly through the House, is implemented in the best form possible, and that we do what we are able to ensure that tragedies, as we saw in the Manchester arena, never happen again.
Conrad.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a privilege to speak today in support of this vital bill. I want to start by joining the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary in paying tribute to the bravery and phenomenal campaigning of Figan Murray. To so selflessly and bravely campaign for the safety of others after suffering such unimaginable trauma is truly inspirational. It is the reason that this legislation is before the House today, and it is the reason that lives will be saved when this bill becomes law. And that should lead to an enormous sense of pride for her and for all the campaigners involved. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a Greater Manchester Member of Parliament, this legislation is especially poignant, coming as it does out of the Manchester Arena attack in 2017, which united Manchester, our region, and our country in grief. 22 people died that night, and many more were left with lifelong physical and psychological trauma. First and foremost, they suffered from an act of indescribable evil and cowardice from people who seek to destroy what binds us and our way of life. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, they did also suffer as a result of security arrangements at Manchester Arena that were not proportional to the severe threat posed by terrorism. The Manchester Arena inquiry carried out by Sir John Saunders found multiple missed opportunities for detecting and stopping the bomber, or at the very least minimising the number of casualties that he was able to inflict. Sir John spoke of serious shortcomings from the operators of the arena, the company tasked with the concert security, and the British Transport Police, including a lack of preparedness and a lack of communication regarding suspicious behaviour between security employees. And that contributed to the attacker being able to do covert reconnaissance on the arena undetected and to find a CCTV blind spot. Underpinning these missed opportunities was a failure to treat the terror threat with the severity it deserved. At that point, it was classed as severe, but now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as we know, the terror threat facing the country is classed as substantial, with an attack sadly likely. And indeed, we know that since the Manchester Arena bombing, that 43 terror plots on UK venues have been foiled at a late stage. And as Figa Murray, I know herself, said, we've been lucky 43 times, but they only need to be lucky once. And that is why there is such an urgent need for this overdue bill. And I am proud that the government is treating this issue as the priority that it deserves. After all, our most basic responsibility in this place is to do everything we can to ensure the safety and security of our residents. The Prime Minister promised he would act, and he has done so just months into his administration. So I thank him and the Home Office team for their swift action to deliver us to this stage. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the striking thing for me about this legislation is how common sense it all is. You would be hard-pressed to find a constituent who disagrees that all public premises should take reasonably practical measures to mitigate the impacts of a terrorist plot. And similarly, it feels like a significant oversight that there wasn't previously a mandate for who is responsible for implementing these measures, as there will be should this bill become law. These are common sense proposals to deal with serious issues, something every bill in this place seeks, but does not always achieve. And that is why this bill has such strong support, I know, on all sides of the House. I note also the supportive comments of the head of counter-terrorism policing, Matt Jukes, who talked of the opportunity that this bill brings to drive greater consistency amongst businesses and communities and to take simple, low or no-cost measures that will save lives. And so I appreciate that there have been concerns expressed about the burden that will be placed on businesses, particularly smaller music venues who I know are still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. But with the support of a dedicated regulator to help them and a period of 24 months to prepare, I don't believe that any business is facing obstacles that cannot be overcome, and I thank the Home Secretary for setting out the tiered approach the government is taking. And I know that much more will be said about support for businesses as this bill progresses through the House. But for this to be as effective as possible, we need collaboration between government, business and campaigners. And we have a duty to make this bill as effective as possible. Because while it cannot remove the hurt or the pain of those who suffered a loss in the Manchester Arena attacks, or ease the pain of those who are living with their injuries, it can forever reduce the likelihood of such an event happening again, and it will save lives, and that is why I'm proud to support this bill. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as this House reflects on the measures we must take to protect our nation, it is essential, as others have already done, that we remember the tragedy of the 22nd of May 2017, when the Manchester Arena bombing claimed 22 lives in a shocking act of terror. Now, those of us who are from Greater Manchester all know someone who was there that night, whether they were watching the concert, picking up their daughters, or responding as a member of our emergency services. And among the 22 who were lost that night was Martin Hett, a young man from Stockport, full of life, boundless energy, and a personality that lit up every room he entered. Martin was 29 years old, and for anyone who knew him, as many of my constituents from Hazel Grove did, he was a symbol of joy and creativity. His love for life, humour, and a unique way of connecting with people left a lasting impression on so many Stopfordians. Martin's mum, Fegan, endured a loss no parent should ever have to face. However, Fegan's response to this unimaginable pain has been one of remarkable strength and resolve. She's become a tireless advocate for change and an inspiration to all of us. And in memory of her son, Fegan has led the campaign for Martin's Law. Her efforts have not gone unnoticed, and over the years, Fegan has worked with policymakers, security experts, and communities to push for these changes, with the goal of ensuring that no other family has to experience what she and her family have had to. Her determination has turned a personal tragedy into a powerful force for good. She's taken her message to government of different shades and public forums and to schools, reminding us of the urgent need for better safety measures in public spaces, and Martin's Law is a testament to her courage. Madam Deputy Speaker, I must also pay tribute to the people of Greater Manchester. It was Greater Manchester who came together in an extraordinary display of solidarity and resilience and compassion. And in the immediate aftermath of the attack, our city region stood tall. Taxi drivers offered free rides to those stranded. Residents opened their homes to concert goers in need, and local businesses provided food and shelter to strangers. Greater Manchester is a city region known for its gumption and its strength. And that night, we showed the world what true unity looks like. In the days that followed, St Anne's Square became a place of mourning, of reflection, and of community. And thousands of people gathered there to pay tribute to the victims, to light candles, and to lay flowers, as well as across the region. I remember gathering in Romiley Precinct because it was important to be with our neighbours and to feel part of our community. It was not just a moment of mourning, it was a really powerful statement that our city region would not be broken by terror. The Mancunian way speaks to that enduring spirit, a refusal to be defined by fear, but by our unity and our resolve. And it was evident in the tireless work of the emergency services who responded with bravery and professionalism on that terrible night. And it was seen in the action of the countless volunteers who came forward offering what they could to help. This attack sought to sow fear and division, but it only brought us closer together and reminded us all of what truly makes Greater Manchester great, its people. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we consider the legislation before us today, we must remember the 22 lives lost and the families forever changed, as well as the resilience of the people of Greater Manchester. We must honour the memory of Martin and the work of Fegan, who's campaigned for Martin's Law. It's not just a call for better security, but a testament to the power of love and community in the face of terror. Madam Deputy Speaker, this legislation is intended to ensure that businesses and organisations are better prepared to deal with and respond to terror-related threats. The tragic arena attack exposed deficiencies in the security of public venues, and this legislation aims to address those gaps by imposing a legal duty on owners and the operators of public venues to assess the risk of terror-related security threats and to implement proportionate security measures. Attention should be drawn to the party responsible for complying with the regulations set out in the bill. It's the owner, the operator, or the leaseholder of the venue. And this bill applies to any premises that at times will host 200 or more people, ranging from nightclubs and sports grounds to leisure centres, schools and universities. And a key distinction should be made and is made between the three categories to which the bill applies. Enhanced duty premises, which may expect 800 attendees from time to time, qualifying events, any event that will have public access and may host 800 or more, and standard duty premises, which may host at least 200 people at times. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the new threshold for standard duty premises of 200 individuals. This largely addresses the concerns raised by action with communities in rural England and will reduce the burden on the organisers and operators of the thousands of community-run venues, such as village halls, community halls and church halls. And they might be being used for community groups, exercise classes and weddings in rural areas, where the terrorist threat is usually low. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, some concerns remain. The bill grants the Home Secretary the power to lower the 200-person threshold to 100, and such a change should require a strong, specific justification related to a clear and widespread threat. And in such cases, less burdensome alternatives, like increased police engagement with smaller venues, should be considered. We urge the Government to carefully examine whether the benefits of the bill are proportional to the potential costs for smaller venues and their operators. And further, the bill contains little scope to train venue operators in their new responsibilities and leaves them preparing the required procedures with, in our view, not enough support. The Government will need to address this for such legislation to be its most effective. Madam Deputy Speaker, at this stage, the Liberal Democrats support Martin's Law and look forward to further constructive scrutiny as it progresses through Parliament. Martin's Law represents a step forwards in ensuring the safety of our public spaces. The devastating attack at the arena in 2017 serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist and the heavy price we pay when they are exploited. We owe it to the victims and their families and to every citizen to learn from that tragedy, to take measures to prevent it from happening again. By strengthening the security of our venues and enhancing our preparedness, we honour the memory of all of those lost, and we demonstrate our commitment to protecting the public from such senseless acts of terror.
Kirith Entwistle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Greater Manchester is my home, and in a recent podcast, Sir Ian McKellen said, if you ever arrive in Manchester, if you're lucky enough to be able to afford a train fare, you come down the steps of Piccadilly, and if you're lucky enough to be able to afford a taxi, you get in the back of one, and the taxi driver, usually a man, but not always, says, "Where are you going to, love?" He goes on to say, "Where grown men call strangers love." I think if we all did that, it would be a rather better place, wouldn't it? This is the Greater Manchester I recognise, and I'm proud of. Though I'm not a native, I've come to know the warm, welcoming compassion of its people. This is the Greater Manchester that was shaken to its core with the unspeakable devastation caused by the arena bombing, an act so far removed from the values of the place I now call home. And I'd like to join the Home Secretary in commending the action Manchester took in effectively enacting Martin's Law following the dreadful attack. I know that members from all sides of this House who have visited our region, even for a brief moment, will recognise the warmth and compassion that I speak of. This bill, Martin's Law, is an important step to help ensure that no other family, no other mother, and indeed no other parent has to endure the same pain and loss that Fegan Murray and so many others have faced. Everyone in Greater Manchester and across the country should feel safe when they attend public venues, whether they're at a local theatre production, a concert, a football match, or simply enjoying a day out. They should know that their children will be safe too. In my part of Greater Manchester, Bolton North East, our vibrant arts sector is the heartbeat of the community. Local venues like the Albert Halls and the Octagon Theatre, which will fall under the standard tier of this legislation, play a vital role in bringing people together and providing spaces where families can celebrate creativity and culture. For smaller venues like these, it's crucial that we strike the right balance, ensuring that both safety and culture can thrive side by side. I'd like to quickly end by paying tribute to Fegan and her campaign team, who have worked tirelessly to keep this bill on the agenda. I'd also like to express my sincere thanks to my right honourable friend, the entire Home Office team and the Prime Minister in wasting no time at all in bringing Martin's Law to the House within the first 100 days of this government. And I look forward to supporting this bill through the House.
Hear, hear.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I think it's right at this particular moment that we all pause to remember those who've lost their lives in terrorist acts across not just recent years but across many decades. And I pay tribute in particular to Figan Murray, as the whole House has recognised during this debate, the mother of Minehead, who along with other families have lost their loved ones to terrorism and who has single-handedly, if I may say so, championed Martin's Law. I've had the greatest privilege of spending time with Figan and so many other families, and to be really quite frank, it is quite a moment to even listen to not just the concerns, not just the heartbreak and the suffering, but actually the determination and the resolve to seek justice for their loved ones and to steer through, across different political parties, their determination to bring this legislation forward in Parliament. And I don't have enough words really to pay tribute to Figan and so many others. And it is the tragedy that has affected their lives that has really led them to stand tall. And there are individuals as well, like Travis Frayne, who has made such a big impact in standing up and giving voice, really, to the victims of these atrocities. And they all deserve the greatest recognition and respect. They have shown a great deal of courage to deal with pain, suffering, and the trauma they have experienced, to work towards making our country, our community safe, but also protecting other citizens. And that is protecting other citizens from really the suffering and the hardships that they themselves have faced. And it's a testament to their campaign that Martin's Law has consistently attracted cross-party support. And so I do want to thank everyone in the House, the both front benches, the Home Affairs Select Committee, which examined the draft bill as well, and everyone who's worked on progressing Martin's Law, actually from 2021 onwards, which was effectively when the first consultation, there was an 18-week consultation that took place, which provided some startling insights into the public's attitudes towards protection of venues and the type of steps that they wanted their government to actually advance. And so many people have been involved in this legislation. I do, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to pay tribute to a former security minister as well, who worked on this back with me in the Home Office, and that's James Brokenshire, because he was a diligent security minister who led this work. And this month marks the 3rd anniversary of his passing, and he will be in our thoughts. And of course, our thoughts and prayers must also be with Sir David Amis and his family, whose murder took place 3 years ago tomorrow. And, you know, we look at that plaque in the same way in which we look at the plaque in memory of Joe Cox as well here. Again, victims and their families of atrocities that took place in our country. I will give way, yeah.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Member for her tributes to both David Amis and to Joe Cox, and just to join her in those tributes. As we remember David tomorrow, I think he'll be very much in our hearts and the family, and likewise for Joe and all of her family as well. And she is right to do so. Thank you.
And Secretary for her comments. And I think actually debates like this concentrate all our minds and thoughts in terms of how we must work together. And it is so sad because, you know, many members have been here with respect to Sir David and to Joe, where we've spoken, and in fact great security measures have then been enacted, and in fact all tribute to Mr. Speaker and to staff members as well, in which, you know, everyone has stepped up. But there is a thread here, which is the suffering, the loss and the pain. And as we've touched on the debates thus far, when it comes to the Manchester Arena tragedy, and it is still a tragedy that I think will live with so many of us for so long, the important work of Sir John Saunders. It was an inquiry that I commissioned and set up when I was Home Secretary. The recommendations were absolutely shocking in many cases, and those families had to sit through the inquiry and participate in the inquiry and be re-traumatised to a certain extent while giving evidence and listening to some of the failings that took place, which of course is deeply painful to listen to. So I think, you know, this is very much about the lessons that we collectively learn, not just across government, but as a society. And with that, of course, this debate and this bill will always be, I think, in the memory, yes, of Martin and so many others that have been affected. I will give way, yes.
I'm extremely grateful to Run giving way, and those recommendations, and I pay tribute to her for setting up that inquiry, didn't stop with this legislation. And whilst it's important that we welcome this in the spirit that has imbued the debate so far, recommendations are referred to in an earlier speech, actually, from that side of the House, on coordination, on some of the failures in respect of the communications between different agencies, do need to be acted on. And in this, notwithstanding the spirit that I described, it is important that scrutiny continues and that we learn the lessons that she's alluded to.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comments, and he will know very, very well from his own time in government, the positions that he served in, where we have been privy to the details of some awful plans, plots, and issues that could have inflicted a lot of problems for our country, that we must always have these policies under review. And I do just want to pay tribute to the work of our security and intelligence services. Their work behind the scenes, Madam Deputy Speaker, is just outstanding, and we are blessed in so many ways that the level of scrutiny, the work that they do, the resources that come from government. I want to pay tribute actually to the team that set up CTOP, which was the new organisation through the last Parliament, the last government that was established, which focused on the integrated approach of our security services when it comes to a lot of the operational work that takes place. This is effectively where we should all not just pay tribute to them, but recognise that this work always has to be kept under review because our threats change. The evolving nature of threats change constantly. And as we know, terrorism isn't just domestic, it actually takes place outside of this country. But if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, coming specifically to the bill itself, this bill has had an extensive process of consideration and consultation. It's taken into account the recommendations and the details contained in reports and inquests, Manchester Arena, on London Bridge, here in Westminster, and other incidents, and that's absolutely right. During my time at the Home Office, we gave a commitment to introduce a protect duty, which was welcomed across the House by campaigners and many businesses too. And that consultation obviously was undertaken in 2021. And we had to consult to consider carefully how best to implement that and improve public safety protections while being mindful, as the House has already touched on and alluded to, many of the impacts upon businesses being proportionate, minimising burdens, particularly on smaller businesses and venues, but also having to contemplate the role and the responsibilities of the regulator, and the Home Secretary has touched on some of this already. Since then, the draft bill was published last year and was considered by the Home Affairs Select Committee. And this year, the standard tier consultation took place. The results were published last month with the bill. And importantly, some changes have been built upon and made. So it's right that these details have gone through scrutiny. I think it's important that we recognise the patience of the campaigners who wanted this bill to come forward much earlier. But actually it's the technicalities and the details in getting this right. There's no point bringing forward legislation if we simply can't operationalise this. The Home Secretary's already spoken about the role of the SIA, and I think we need to consider how the SIA will be equipped adequately. They were resourced heavily, for example, during the COVID pandemic with new duties and responsibilities. But again, it's the practicalities that are important, because this bill brings in an estimated 179,000 premises under the scope of the requirements of Martin's Law, with the distinction in place between those that have a standard duty, as we've already heard from the front bench. And it's right that these provisions are proportionate to the scale and size of the premises and businesses that are concerned, also linked to the risk. But we don't want to see issues where it's not enforceable. And I did want to just ask some questions of the Home Secretary and her team just on this, because she touched on the whole issue around the SIA, the regulator, potential to enforce civil penalties. I think we do need to understand the practicalities of how this works, because she did also highlight that, you know, we don't want to put additional burdens on businesses through the work that's taken place already. But should we see businesses just not stepping up, learning from the past mistakes, the recommendations that, you know, we've learnt from other inquiries, how will this be picked up in particular? Penalties are one thing, but actually going to penalties should be the last resort. We need these institutions and organisations to put public safety first and put practicalities first as well. With this, of course, I'd hope that the Minister responding can talk about the impact on local authorities, local councils, town parishes as well. That's incredibly important. What assurances can be given to the work underway with colleagues in MHCLG to support some of the local authorities on meeting these obligations, including training, the implications, the practicalities of how this will be brought into scope. Will there be financial support to help them meet these obligations? Same with schools and educational institutions around their standard duty. And can the Minister explain what kind of support will be given to them? And second, given the existing measures that some premises have in place to ensure compliance with fire safety, health and safety and crime prevention requirements, will the Minister look carefully at the interplay between those responsibilities so that the guidance isn't complicated, so that it's consistent and comprehensive? And importantly, that this will assist premises in minimising the cost burdens, but have the ability to work in an integrated way. One of the big lessons out of Manchester and Sir John's inquiry and reporting, we know this, it was in the public domain, was the lack of integration between the various services working together. Now, this absolutely has to be recognised, and we must ensure that there is a golden thread going through all the services locally, that they do know how to integrate and work together. The impact assessment clearly gives an estimate of the overall cost around the standard duty and the enhanced duty over a significant period. But I think, again, speaking about the practicalities of what does this really mean for many of these organisations and institutions that will be involved. I'd like to see clarity from the Minister about the role that planning policies may play in the delivery of martial law. This is an important area because through planning policy and planning changes, we might be able to actually make changes within the way buildings are shaped and designed and what local authorities are taking on board, and bring in actually the relevant authorities to provide advice and guidance from the police on how to design out some of these issues and put in safety measures. This could also bring in developers to bring in good designs and new concepts, future-proof in many institutions and buildings and developments going forward. I do want to touch on the nature of terror incidents and the premises that need to be considered, because we do need procedures to examine how best to prevent and deter incidents from taking place and from becoming targets. And monitoring, surveillance, that takes place. That's second nature to our institutions. But how a premise, when it comes to an event, should be responding to a particular threat or even anticipating an incident, and what kind of processes and procedures these premises will be undertaking. So perhaps the Home Secretary or the Minister, when summing up, can just talk a little bit about some of the discussions they've had with key sectors. I know live venues and events are mentioned earlier on, but have they been consulted in terms of what kind of drills and work will be undertaken in terms of not just designing these incidents out, but actually what kind of practical measures they'll be putting in place as well. There are a lot of lessons to be learned just from recent incidences. We saw what happened at London Bridge in 2017. It differed from the Finsbury Park attack, and differed from the Manchester Arena attack, and differed from the Reading Forbury Gardens attack as well. So it's important that the SIA and the regulator and the government work to ensure that those responsible for premises and events have really the full duty and can go into their own planning and preparations in the right way. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do just want to mention one particular inquiry that's taken place, and it's in the news today because we're reminded this week that with the Dawn Sturgis inquiry and the chairing by the Right Honourable Lord Hughes of Ormsby, about the Novichok poisoning that took place in Salisbury in 2018. The harm and damage that caused is also an issue that the government will naturally be considering, because at the end of the day, a hostile state their actions led to the most atrocious and appalling deaths of innocent people in our country. And this reminds us all that incidences come under all sorts of shapes and guises, and again, we need to find better ways in which we can protect the public and put public safety first. So I do want to just conclude my remarks really by wanting to ask the Minister about the support for victims of terrorism. The Home Office had been conducting an internal review to support a package available to victims of terrorism, and considering the introduction of a National Day of Service and tribute to victims of terrorism. Travis Frayne, who the ministerial team will be familiar with and will know of, has been a long-standing and deeply passionate campaigner for this. And I know that ministers prior to the election were looking at this as well. So even if there's a small update, I think we would welcome just an update in where the government's thinking is on supporting victims of terrorism and some of the work that Travis was leading. In conclusion, I note from the programme motion that the government are keen to have this bill complete by its committee stage, I think by November time, mid-November. So I hope that to ensure that this progresses quickly, we can really, across both houses, not just ask the right questions, but work in a very practical way with the industry. We haven't even touched on the insurance industry, but I'm sure the committee stage will cover that all. But really look at some of the practical means in which we can start providing public protection and safety sooner rather than later. And I say this in my concluding remarks, particularly recognising that Fegan, Murray and others are here today watching this debate, that really we owe it to them, their families and so many that have suffered and who've been waiting in anticipation for this legislation. We owe it to them to really start to enact measures in a practical way and give them and the public the confidence that they will be looking to us all to drive this forward with positive outcomes sooner rather than later.
Neil Coyle.
Pleasure to follow the former Home Secretary. I make clear up front that I very much welcome this bill, which means so much to so many for the reasons outlined in Manchester in particular, for the reasons outlined by the Home Secretary, but also those affected by other attacks, terror attacks in our country, including my own community, who were attacked on the 3rd of June 2017 at London Bridge and Borough Market. And of course the measures in this bill are targeted at protecting people from further incidents, primarily large entertainment venues, which makes my constituency still very relevant. The Printworks is being replaced in Rotherhithe, a live music venue. Members here may be familiar with Ministry of Sound, Elephant and Castle, and of course many members will be aware of the Young Vic, which could all be brought into coverage. And of course there are so many thousands of other smaller hospitality venues that could be brought into scope for different levels of requirements under this legislation. As has already been pointed out, we are at substantial risk of further attack, and the people whose motives are to attack us and our way of life sadly choose areas where there are multiple innocent civilians, and there is likely to be an international impact from an attack, which makes constituencies and communities like mine more vulnerable, because we have one of London's busiest train stations, we have part of a World Heritage Site in Tower Bridge, we have millions of visitors at Tate Modern, the Globe Theatre. The Shard itself is a target, sadly, for those who seek to disrupt or destroy our way of life. This bill, I need this bill to be effective to ensure that my constituency can go about its business and way of life routinely with minimal fear. And my community did receive a visit from the former Prime Minister Theresa May after the attack in 2017, which was very welcome. But I'm afraid that the level of support from the former governments was not sufficient. The real strength in rebuilding the community and the footfall at Borough Market and in the local community came from the local community, and our community is still indebted to the former Dean of Southwark Cathedral, Andrew Nunn, now retired, who led and shaped some of the work with his team at Southwark Cathedral, but also the work of the Borough Market Trust, individual traders who operate as very small businesses right through to large restaurants and traders across London. But there were many other local businesses who played their part, including Barclays Bank on Borough High Street, who provided facilities for those locked out of their own premises, and at News UK, who don't often get praise from this political party, but were provided a generous voucher scheme for hundreds of its employees to ensure that the market was receiving more business sooner, for which traders were incredibly grateful. And look, it sounds, I'm almost apologetic in raising this because it sounds really, really niche, but one issue that concerns me is the security barriers, is the bollards, because 7 years on, there have been lots of issues in trying to ensure sufficient external protection to venues. And this comes back to the nature of the attacks we see. Manchester was very different to London Bridge and Borough Market. Many more of the more recent terror attacks we see involve vehicles and involve knives and blades. The vehicle protections are an issue for lots of the venues who will be covered by this, but they will not be able to act alone in installing protective measures. And parts 11 and 12 of the bill require risk assessments, but do not confer sufficient responsibility on all agencies involved in preparedness to prevent an attack that is required currently, is my reading, and I hope that ministers will address that as the bill goes forward. The dispute resolution system in parts 18 to 20 cover use of a premises and venue. They do not cover shared spaces or communal areas. For example, and the very practical experience in Southwark is of the entrance and exits from Transport for London roads, a Southwark Council road, and communal shared space, partly owned by the Borough Market Trust itself. Where there are a mixture of owners and responsibilities, there needs to be a clearer means of delivering the change that's required to make the legislation effective. And I think that needs pumping up. And I just asked the question whether the government needs to work with MHCLG on improving the planning process, so that where measures are identified that are about perhaps in a risk assessment as part of 11 or 12 of this bill, there could be a fast-track process for getting those measures implemented through planning. There are other plans from this government to improve the planning system. That would be a very sensible measure to take forward, I think. Then there is the issue of overview and review of preparedness, and I was really grateful to Pool Reinsurance, who were very helpful after the attack in talking through the changes that the government did make to terror insurance that I supported at the time. But one of the issues they raised a lot was whether there was sufficient coverage, and it seems a reasonable additional part of the legislation to require those with duties under Part 11 and 12 to have terror insurance, because that insurance could be integral to protections and preparedness. And there could be a means of drawing down, written into the bill, there could be a means of drawing down on insurance systems. Now, I don't think when it comes to security measures that the largesse or generosity or imagination of an individual firm should determine whether they will allow venues to draw down on their insurance. I think there needs to be a minimum requirement. And when, I give a practical example, when a Henry Moore piece was, lots were being stolen across London and elsewhere and melted down, and when Southwark Council said we better get rid of ours, actually we worked with the insurer to build some protective measures, including the plinth has an alarm, there are deep planters with concrete bases, there's CCTV, all paid for by the insurer rather than targeted to the residents who have this amazing piece in their backyard. But again, it shouldn't be about the imagination of an individual insurer. It should come down to, perhaps the training costs could be, or training could be provided by pool reinsurance or another actor, or covered by pool reinsurance. And of course, pool reinsurance could provide an annual review of preparedness. How many venues now have protection? This is something that perhaps could be reported back to Parliament or in the public domain at no cost to Home Office, because Pool Ray actually provides something along similar lines elsewhere. and I hope ministers will be examining that. The former Home Secretary also mentioned local authorities and licensing. I agree that the last government loaded additional responsibilities with no new resources onto many councils, including my own, with no recourse to public funds being very much a significant one. This is another area I have a concern. I think the government's intent is clear, but I would ask that there is full cost recovery available for local authorities who are having to assess. There are authorities like my own that will have more responsibility to deliver this, and the cost should not be borne by local taxpayers to provide protective measures to defend everyone who visits those venues. It should be a matter of full cost recovery, and I hope that will be clearer in I think it's part 38 of the bill. That said, again, support this legislation. I hope the issues I've briefly referenced will be addressed as legislation processes. And we all come here to make a difference. This legislation will not just make a difference, it will save lives, and it will weaken the chances of those who seek to attack us and undermine our way of life. And it should be, and I'm glad it's been welcomed by everyone across the House today.
We come to a maiden speech. You must bob if you wish to contribute. Rachel Gilmour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for calling me to make my maiden speech. Before I do, could I commend Fagan Murray and her family and friends for the excellent campaign they have continued completely selflessly, which will save, I'm sure, the lives of possibly hundreds, if not thousands of people. They are a great example to us all. Yeah. I confess to being unusually nervous, as indeed I should be, as I address my honourable colleagues across the House for the first time as the first Member of Parliament for Tiverton and Minehead. I would like to begin by thanking the two previous MPs for Tiverton and Minehead, my honourable fellow Liberal Democrat Richard Ford, who has happily been returned by his constituents in Honiton and Sidmouth as their MP, where he will continue to be a hard-working local champion. I'm also grateful for the 23 years of service that my predecessor in Minehead and West Somerset, Ian Liddell-Granger, in his own inimitable style, gave to my constituents in that part of my constituency. He is a doting grandfather who will now have more time to spend with his grandchildren. I also want to thank Rebecca Powell, the former member for Taunton Deane, a prolific gardener. Vegetables are a particular favourite, I understand, whose constituency encompassed some of the villages and towns now in Tiverton and Minehead, as well as the constituency of Taunton and Wellington. As a new Member of Parliament, even though this place bears a resemblance to my alma mater, it is a difficult and different environment to master. I know that I speak for all new members when I thank all members of the staff of the parliamentary estate, from doorkeepers to police officers to catering and cleaning staff, when I thank them all for their warm welcome, for their tolerance and patience, with the numerous questions they answer with humour and understanding. Thank you all. Yeah. Since September last year, my team, known as Team Terrific and the Stalwarts, have knocked on nearly 31,000 doors, delivered hundreds of thousands of leaflets, letters and surveys, and spoken to over 12,000 residents. I know what matters to the people of Tiverton and Minehead because I've asked them. I was raised in Somerset and have spent most of my adult life in Devon, from Holcombe Rogus via Hemyock to Bampton in the Tiverton and Minehead constituency. My husband and I chose to raise our family in Devon. In fact, all four of our children are born Devonians. Our eldest sons, Henry and Tom, were born in the old hospital in Tiverton. It is my sincere intention to support the NHS and social care systems in Tiverton and Minehead by keeping our local hospitals open in Minehead, Tiverton and Willerton and supporting all our GP surgeries. Ours is a very rural area and the need to keep local hospitals open is especially pressing, with limited transport links and higher than average elderly population. As a rural and often disconnected constituency, transport improvements are one of my key priorities. With that in the forefront of my mind, I have convened a meeting with the Peninsula Transport, the body which oversees all public transport in Devon and Somerset, along with my transport advisor, David Northey, who has a deep history in this area as a former head of strategic planning at Great Western Railway. I've been hard at work for my constituents, putting together a transport plan, highlighting the challenges and solutions for rail and bus services across Tiverton and Minehead. Minehead train station desperately needs linking to the main line at Taunton, and I know my honourable friend and neighbour in Taunton and Wellington would agree. We need to also secure the numbers 25 and 28 bus services in the north of the constituency and look carefully at rural bus routes to services the villages of Exmoor, such as Exford, Withypool, Winsford, with local towns, particularly Wiveliscombe. These will be key parts of that new plan for the local area. Poor public transport provision creates a particular barrier to school children and students in Tiverton and Minehead. Some have no bus to take them to school, no way to walk to school, or no way to cycle to get there. Other than a small A-level provision at West Somerset Community College, there is no, I repeat, no sixth form provision in my constituency. Students have to travel to Exeter, Taunton or Bridgewater if they wish to pursue their studies. This limits their aspirations and their ability to succeed. Shockingly, West Somerset ranks 324th out of 324 on the Social Mobility Index, and such transport problems explain some of why this is. However, teachers and heads in primary schools across the constituency and secondary schools in Tiverton, Minehead, Willerton and Ufcombe do not lack aspiration for their pupils. They are working daily to improve access to better education. This includes campaigning to have facilities that are worthy of the 21st century educational standards. The first letter I wrote, within days of getting elected on July 5th, was to our new Secretary of State for Education, asking for a meeting to discuss the dire state of Tiverton High School. Nearly 25 years ago, Tiverton High School was promised a new build. The previous Labour government put it on their priority list. The last Conservative government sat on their hands and did nothing. The school is deemed to be at danger of death from flooding by the Environment Agency. There is asbestos in the sports hall. Children are being taught in dining and communal areas. It has capacity for 1,300 pupils, but needs capacity for 1,800. Given the pledges made by our new Prime Minister and his commitment to schools, I know that I will get a fair hearing from the Secretary of State for Education, and I hope that she will agree to meet a delegation of staff, parents and children from Tiverton High School in the near future. Community plays a crucial role in Tiverton and Minehead. There are wonderful organisations providing support and help, from community food banks to support groups for carers, to Rotary clubs, conservation groups and environmental networks with whom I work to monitor and prevent the pollution in our rivers and on our beaches. They all make Tiverton and Minehead the wonderful, beautiful, special part of the UK that it is. When these organisations meet to discuss important community issues, the provisions of the Protection of Premises Bill will ensure that they are safe. However, my party has previously had some concerns about the impact on smaller scale venues, which I'm delighted to have heard today has been more light touch than one was expecting. As a former director of the NFU, I have a deep passion for and understanding of my local farming community, spread across the constituency and facing harder challenges than they have for generations. This is thanks to the disastrous Brexit deal foisted upon them by the previous Conservative government. In the face of climate change, increased rainfall, drier summers and the rising cost of energy, they better battle on. To them I say, I will always back my farming community. Let's work together to secure a future for farming across Exmoor, West Somerset and Mid-Devon. Come to my monthly farmers' surgery so I can represent my farming community to the very best of my abilities. Becoming an MP has been my ambition since I was 17, when I joined the Liberal Party at school. It has taken me 4 attempts over 43 years of campaigning, but now that dream has become a reality. Without my family, it would have been impossible. As a professional woman, I have broken several glass ceilings, thanks to my inspirational grandmothers, Mabel and Jessie, who were offered wise counsel. Miss Waite, now Mrs. Michael Lim, my Latin teacher who kept me sane at boarding school, and especially my mother, who has always believed in me. Mummy, thank you. I love you. I am so proud to have her here today with my husband, our eldest son, in the gallery so she can see this moment. Yesterday, I celebrated my 70 years birthday. To my Conservative colleagues whose maths skills in government were found somewhat wanting, that's 60. I share my birthday I share my birthday with Margaret Hilda Thatcher, who must be one of the best recruiting agents for the Liberal and Labour parties. I am proud that I share nothing else with her other than a birthday. My passion for politics flows from my compassion for my fellow human beings, whoever and wherever they are, irrespective of background, race, religion, colour, gender, sexuality or ability. It is impossible to mention everyone and everything in one's maiden speech, but if there's one thing I would wish my constituents to know, it is this. They are my world. I feel humbled and honoured to have been elected to represent Tiverton and Minehead in Parliament. They can help me do my job by coming to my surgeries in Tiverton, Minehead, Witherliscombe and on Exmoor, ringing my office and my staff, and writing us letters and emails. I am at their service.
Yeah. Fabulous at 60, Mabel Jessie, and your mum will be very proud. Now we have another maiden speech, Matt Bishop.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member for Tiverton and Minehead in her maiden speech. And it's a privilege to speak to you today as the new member for the Forest of Dean. I would firstly like to extend my well wishes to my predecessor, Mark Harper, for his 19 years of service to the Forest of Dean. A few years ago, when I was Chair of Governors of St White's Primary School in Cinderford, Mark helped to secure funding for a new school building. Together we worked to finally get the school that was so badly needed after 40 years of it crumbling before. With his help, it was instrumental during that time, and I appreciate all he did for us. I'm the second Labour MP, and only the third ever MP, to represent the Forest of Dean constituency since its recreation in 1997. And I'd also like to agree wholeheartedly with both of my predecessors, Mark and the great Diana Organ, who stated in their maiden speeches that the Forest of Dean really is the most beautiful constituency in the UK. I know many others have also made that claim over the last year, but how many can boast that their constituency landscapes have graced the screens of iconic shows and films? Puzzlewood, for example, has served as the stunning backdrop for many shows, including Doctor Who episodes and even a Star Wars movie. This brings the beauty of the forest to the big screen, allowing individuals from all over the world an insight into the place that I call home. I also invite all the honourable and right honourable members to visit the forest, where you will not only witness its natural beauty, but also a collection of individuals and groups who understand the importance of community. We have inspiring organisations such as the Forest Voluntary Action Forum, who support many community-led projects shaped with and for local people, and the Wilderness Centre, who provide exceptional day and residential visits for schools from primary, secondary and independent sectors. This community spirit is also evident through the actions of the individuals. Just a few weeks ago, we experienced some localised flooding after the intense rainfall, and being a rural constituency, many areas, roads and houses became almost impossible to reach. But during these floods, I saw our local farmers in places such as Westbury-on-Severn and Sedbury coming to people's rescue without hesitation, picking people up in their tractors and getting them home safely. I might have been one of the lucky ones to receive that help as well. It is the spirit of this solidarity that inspired me to move to the forest 17 years ago, the place where my wife grew up and the place where we chose to raise my children, surrounded by a community full of kind-hearted individuals. However, certain issues persist that require urgent attention. Many residents experience isolation due to inadequate public transport and a lack of community centres. There is a shortage of bus services, there are limited routes and poorly maintained roads. With only 5% of the constituency in built-up areas, substantially improving public transport is vital for relationships to thrive and combat the isolation that many residents feel. I also welcome my constituents' campaigns to turn the site of the former Dilk Memorial Hospital into a mental health and wellbeing centre, campaigning to have a dedicated space within the community highlights the drive and determination of my constituents to ensure that no one is left behind. Throughout my career in public service, I've been exposed to the great challenges within our society and appreciate the vital role that national government, local council and the community plays in addressing these issues. Deputy Madam Speaker, I served for many years as a police officer, including 4 years here in London for the Metropolitan Police. On the 7th of July 2005, I was one of the first officers on scene at the Tavistock Square bus bombing, where I saw firsthand the horror, destruction and chaos caused by such despicable acts of terror. But I was also struck by the many admirable examples of courage and determination demonstrated by the emergency services, injured victims and members of the public. And perhaps now it is only right that we take just a second to remember and pay tribute to all those who lost their lives or were injured during the attacks on our country on the 7th of July 2005. My time as a police officer has also shown me the importance of ensuring that our residents feel safe, and I'm acutely aware that the security of our communities, locally and nationally, must be a priority for this government. That is why I chose this debate to make my maiden speech. I wholeheartedly support Martin's Law, and I'm so pleased to see it implemented so early on in this Labour government. Education is another particular prominent issue within my constituency. And as a former school governor in multiple schools and a local councillor, I've seen how national policy directly affects our local education system, which have long suffered due to funding decisions made over the last 14 years. During a recent visit to the Forest High School in Cinderford, I was alarmed by the state of the school buildings which were crumbling before me. This is no exaggeration when I say that classrooms were flooded, ceilings were collapsing and the flooring was falling to pieces. We can have the best teachers in the world, but without a basic, safe building, how can they provide the education that they so want to provide? Our children deserve better, and they deserve better now. They deserve schools that inspire learning and growth, not ones that are collapsing. And over recent years, the state of our schools has been forgotten, but I, along with this new Labour government, will not allow this to continue. There's a song about the Forest of Dean, which my constituency will know. It's called The Land Between Two Rivers, written by a constituent, Dick Bryce. Later. The song pretty much sums up our constituency. But for too long, these rivers, the Wye and the Severn, have suffered from pollution and sewage issues. However, the communities in Newnham-on-Severn, Lydbrook, Lydney and many more villages and towns have rallied around to demand action from the government. And I am committed to bringing their voices to Parliament to reinvigorate the ecosystem and protect our wildlife. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to stand before you as a representative for the people of the Forest of Dean. This position is a responsibility I take seriously, and I aim to serve with the same dedication and spirit of cooperation that I observe in our community.
Yeah. Well done. Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I join others in the House in paying tribute to Fegan Murray and her fellow campaigners who have been tireless advocates for positive change. May I also congratulate the two new members on their maiden speeches today. The Honourable Member for Tiverton and Minehead, well, I think we could all do with a team of terrific and the stalwarts, and I'm sure both Mabel and Jessie will be looking down incredibly proud of her comments. And to the Honourable Member from the Forest of Dean, may I pay tribute to his service as a police officer and the courage that he showed in carrying out his duties. Madam Deputy Speaker, there can be no doubt in any of our minds as to the importance of today's debate. The horrific events that took place at Manchester Arena will be forever etched in our collective memory. My thoughts go out to all of those who have been affected by these and other terrorist attacks that we've witnessed sadly in recent years. When we are shaken by such egregious events, it reinforces that the first responsibility of any government, and all of us on these green benches, is the protection and safety of our citizens. It is incumbent upon us to take action to prevent these tragic moments in history from repeating themselves. That is why I believe this bill is a necessary piece of legislation to bring peace of mind and reassurance, to stand up to those who look to harm us and tear our communities apart. However, notwithstanding my overarching support for this bill, I note the significant requirements it places upon the events, entertainment and hospitality industries. Many in these industries are still recovering from the legacy of the pandemic. The financial requirements of this bill to be compliant will add further pressures. And I would therefore invite the Minister to consider offering financial and logistical support, especially to smaller organisations who struggle to predict footfall. This is particularly pertinent to those premises who experience seasonal peaks and troughs over the course of the year. As the bill currently stands, Madam Deputy Speaker, these local establishments will still fall under the qualifying premises as defined by Clause 2, subsection 2c, and will be required to put in extra measures at a personal cost. The second point that I wish to touch upon is that terrorist attacks evolve at a rapid pace. As we've seen over recent times, their evolution is much faster than the time it takes for legislation to pass through this House. I therefore inquire of the Minister, firstly, as to what considerations have been made to accommodate for this, and secondly, will there be regular reviews of the threats and countermeasures through the governing body? My third and final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that in its current state, the bill does not accommodate for organisations run by volunteers and temporary staff. Large places of worship and sporting venues all rely on the good-natured will of volunteers and paid agency staff in their peak times. I would therefore ask the Minister to engage with such organisations to find training arrangements that suit their capabilities, as well as meets the threshold for safety and security being sought after within this bill. Those queries aside, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the introduction of this Act.
Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd firstly like to thank Bergen Murray for her tireless campaigning, and I rise today to speak in favour of the Terrorism and Protection Premises Bill, which represents a vital step forward in our collective responsibility to keep people safe. The tragic events of Manchester reminded us all too clearly of the need for practical measures to safeguard our public spaces and our vulnerabilities. The bill provides a framework to ensure that venues and businesses take appropriate steps to protect the public from the threat of terrorism, and I fully support its aims. The need for this bill is clear. Terrorism remains a real and persistent threat, and we've seen in Manchester, Birmingham and London that terrorism and terrorists are blind to the loss of human life. Public venues are often the target for those to seek to harm us. This legislation will ensure that public spaces are better equipped to manage potential risk, reducing the likelihood of attacks and mitigate their impact should they occur. We have a duty to protect our constituents, whether they are attending a religious service, a wedding or a concert. We know around 2,000 businesses in Dudley could be affected by this legislation based on VAT and payee registrations. It's our responsibility to make sure these places are not only secure, but to also support in making the necessary steps to keep their doors open and their customers safe. This bill places a duty on venues and businesses to assess their risk and take reasonable steps to mitigate them. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The security measures will be proportionate to size and type of the venue. Larger venues, like stadiums, will need to implement more comprehensive protections, while small venues can adopt simpler measures, which I also agree. By providing clear guidance and support, this bill will contribute to the collective safety of our communities. That said, we need to be mindful of the challenges that this may propose, particularly to SMEs, charities and places of worship. In Dudley, these institutions are the backbone of the community, providing support and a safe space for people to gather. Many of them are concerned about the potential costs and the operational demands that this bill may bring. I welcome the government's commitment to a risk-based approach which ensures smaller organisations won't face the same level of security measures as larger venues. And I'm encouraged by the idea of providing tailored guidance and practical support, and I hope that this will develop further as the bill progresses. This bill is an important and necessary step in protecting our communities from the threat of terrorism. It strikes the right balance between providing security and ensuring the measures are practical and appropriate. I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House and with the Government to ensure that this bill delivers safety and security to our communities, which they desperately deserve, and will provide the necessary steps for those who have been affected.
Here.
Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard from many members today who have huge venues in their constituencies, such as the member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark who mentioned Ministry of Sound. I would like to take this opportunity to add the voice for rural venues like those in my constituency of North Cornwall. Well, this bill is clearly absolutely necessary to protect the safety of millions across the country who enjoy events. This legislation needs extremely careful planning and scrutiny to ensure that small venues aren't themselves put at risk through additional red tape. In such rural constituencies like mine of North Cornwall, small to medium events are truly the lifeblood of bringing together far-flung communities, and they have been for generations. Thousands of community and volunteer-run venues will be designated responsible under Clause 4 of this legislation for any failures and are liable to face strict penalties. I'm invited to, and I often visit, small venues all around North Cornwall, and I see firsthand the joy, the spirit and the positivity that they inject to their surrounding communities. I will give way.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that he mentions rural communities because the stain of terror reaches across the United Kingdom. One of the victims of the Ariana Grande attack was Ailey MacLeod, a 14-year-old schoolgirl from the Isle of Barra, whose mother, like many other parents, felt the ground shake and heard the blast of the report which took her life and the lives of 22 others. The response in Barra has been to set up a musical trust in Ailey's name to allow other young people to reach their potential. And that response, and the response of the Murray family in this tremendous campaign, shows that terrorism will not divide us, and our collective response here shows that while it may cast a shadow on the hearts and lives of those left behind, it will not diminish us.
Thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and I completely agree that terrorism should never divide us. What an excellent phrase. If we're not realistic and proportionate with the details of this bill, then I do fear cherished, beloved venues like those in my own constituency, like Haywood Cider Farm, the Royal Cornwall Show, as well as countless pubs, the St Mabon Inn, the Golden Lion in Port Isaac, the Beat in Bodmin. All of these cherished community centres as well will potentially be taking a hit, especially in the summertime when thousands are enjoying the outdoors. Those venues with lots of outdoor space can easily reach this 200 threshold capacity. But of course, the safety and security of event goers should always be kept at the top of our priorities when planning any such large-scale events. But we must not overlook the unrealistic necessity for thousands of smaller venues having to comply with very strict restrictions and possibly facing fines in the thousands for non-compliance. If I could just turn to some of the specifics in the legislation, Clause 13 gives the SIA power to issue compliance notices if they have reasonable grounds that a regulation has been contravened.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank you very much. Would my honourable friend agree that as well as training, there is a need to take the opportunity to look at the regulation around the SIA, those working in the security industry? In the last 5 years, licences have been granted by the SIA to a staggering 95,000 door supervisors who haven't been resident in the UK for 5 years. And so, therefore, we cannot even know their history and the criminal record. And would he agree that personnel working in that field not only need to be well trained, but also need the confidence of the public?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I wholeheartedly agree with her comments. I do hope that small venues are given the opportunity as well to remedy any contravention before any such notice is issued. Likewise, Clause 14 of the Bill provides for restriction notices on non-compliant venues. The Secretary of State said in her remarks earlier that penalties will only be issued for repeat offenders, and I hope on that point that there will be mechanisms and trainings to prevent such repeat offences. I also do have some concerns around the penalties outlined in Clause 18 of the legislation, which provides for up to £10,000 in fines for smaller venues termed as standard duty premises. As I've already alluded to, this could finish off some of our smaller venues, and if they don't receive proper training or the opportunity to remedy such contravention, on the theme of protecting these smaller venues, I really am also concerned about the provision which allows the Home Secretary to drop the capacity threshold from 200 to 100. The circumstances where this can be done should be very tightly defined. The way a venue's capacity is defined will also need some careful thought. While a community hall, for example, might be able to take 200 people in theory, in practice this could actually be extremely rare. I'm very pleased to see that the capacity amount has been increased from the initial 100 to 200. I welcome that, and I'll be keenly watching the progress of that during the Bill Committee stage to ensure this remains in practice. Provided that these protections are put in place, Liberal Democrats on these benches will of course support this crucial and important bill. Safety and security must always be paramount. I'd like to just end my remarks, if I may, with a quote from Brendan Cox, the husband of the late MP Joe Cox and founder of Survivors Against Terror. Survivors of terror attacks aren't looking for sympathy, they're looking for change that makes it less likely that others will need to endure what they have. I'm pleased to support this bill, and I'm pleased to see support for it across this House. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin, as so many in this debate have, by paying tribute to Figan Murray and the campaigners for Martin's Law to respond to such tragedy by trying to make the world a better place deserves our highest admiration. I'm very pleased that the Government has brought this legislation forward so quickly in the parliamentary session. It is a very important piece of legislation. The threat that the country faces is substantial. This means that it is complex, it is enduring, but it is also evolving. And so that it's right that we adapt and update the legislation that we use to prevent and deal with terror in response to that. The terror threat consistently changes. Previously, we used to worry about attacks on national infrastructure or iconic sites. Now we worry about them at concerts and bars. That's why it's critical we strengthen security at public events. I am a representative of Edinburgh, a city known for putting on numerous events, especially in August, where the festival is the third biggest ticketed event in the world. I spoke to Edinburgh City Council in advance of this debate, and they told me they were hugely supportive of this legislation, which will help not them, but all the venues and premises in the city prepare for a terrorist attack. And Edinburgh would like to offer itself as a pilot site if the Home Office is interested in testing how this legislation will work in practice. Because combating the evolving terror threat means adapting and updating, which this bill does, and it also means recognising that combating terrorism requires a multi-pronged approach. And that's one of the most important components of this bill, is that it includes measures to prevent a terror attack and put obstacles in the way of terrorists. But what's new and important is that it provides for premises to develop their the way in which they will handle an attack once it has begun. This is so critical. Getting venues to think, prepare, develop protocols before an event, before the emergency services arrive on the scene, is how you minimise casualties and how you save lives. This is an important component of our national defences against terror. I would just like to make one specific point on the use of the SIA as a regulator. I welcome this, and I think it is the appropriate place for the regulation of this to be. Yes, Elgibly.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving way. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would also like to praise the Government for their swift movement in bringing about the House Martin's Law and echo the words for our campaigners and in the memory of Martin and all those who have killed in terrorist attacks in our country, and also echo our thanks to the security services. Madam Deputy Speaker, with the planned introduction of the bill and the recent announcements of the SIA as the regulator, many businesses in the security industry, like the brilliant Vespasian in the constituency of Portsmouth North, have asked if the Minister would come to a review of the current SIA core legislation and power to support the security industry in the implementation of the law and the invaluable work that they do on our front line to counter terrorism and indeed to save lives. Thank you.
To Chris Murray.
Thank you. My honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and we have got big discussions to be had around the role of the SIA as they adapt to these changes as well, and I think she makes a very important point. As I say, I do think the SIA is an appropriate place for the regulation of this legislation to be situated. But after 15 years of long experience of dealing with the Home Office and with the Home Office's bodies and authorities, I've found that very often these organisations can be very overstretched and struggle to deal with the diversity of organisations they have to deal with in the UK. The former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Witham, made the point that there's no point in legislating if you aren't able to operationalise. And so I would implore the Minister to look at the SIA's funding and resources to ensure that this legislation has the desired effect. I would make one final point, if I may, which is to say that national security is, of course, a reserved matter, but some of the aspects of this bill may touch on issues that are devolved, such as fire services, justice and policing. And so I hope the Home Office will be working constructively with the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations to ensure the implementation is as smooth as possible across the nations of the United Kingdom. And so, finally, I would just like to close in saying that I strongly support this bill. I'm very pleased to see it come so swiftly to Parliament and look forward to the impact it will have in the communities that want to see it. Thank you.
Jim Allister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join without reservation in supporting Martin's Law, and I think it is important that we salute the campaigning and the courage of Martin's family, and it is appropriate then that colloquially the bill is indeed named Martin's Law. What happened in Manchester was shocking and chilling to the core of us all, and of course reflective of so many acts of brutal, wicked terrorism that has been experienced right across this nation, not least in my own part of the United Kingdom. And here we are today, properly debating under the rules of due process and doing things in order, rules and laws to help us deal with terrorism. Conscious, of course, that terrorists play by no rules. They do not live within the confines of regulation or restraint or anything which would meet the standards of human rights. Quite the reverse. And to that extent, society as a whole struggles because of its determination to live within the rule of law, struggles on occasions to deal with the excesses of terrorism. all the more reason why we need to do all and everything we can, even in the small things. And this bill, I suppose, in the main, is about the small things of dealing with terrorism, to try and put ourselves in the best possible position to deal with the potential and the threat which exists sadly across this nation of terrorism. And in doing that, of course, I think we have to be realistic that all the dots and stroking all the T's is good, it's necessary. But fundamentally, terrorism will only be defeated across this nation when there is no room for terrorism, when it meets the full rigour of the law, and when that rigour of the law puts it out of business. That is the fundamental reality of all of this. I do, though, want to make a few comments about some of the particulars of this bill. I do have some concerns about its potential overreach. The Honourable Member for North Cornwall touched on some of this. Small schools, small churches, now subject to further regulatory requirements. I chair a board of governors of a small country school. We already have to have policies on fire safety, on health and safety, on dealing with emergencies. All good, all necessary. But in this bill, I'd like the Minister to explain what is the practical addition that's going to be put upon, say, small rural schools and their boards of governors, as to what it is they have to provide that they're not already providing in their emergency policies, in their fire safety policies, in their health and safety policies. I think boards of governors in particular will want to know that, and will particularly want to know that when they operate within very, very restrained budgets. Every penny, I know in the school I'm involved with, is accounted for, is needed for the fundamental provision. And I am concerned that this bill, in its global approach, might put upon very small users unbearable bureaucratic and financial burdens. I noticed that the impact assessment said the majority of the costs will fall upon the businesses that have to operate it. That also means the majority of the costs will fall upon small schools, small churches, small community organisations, and all the rest of it. And that is a concern that I would have some worries about. Earlier in the debate, an honourable member made the point that what would this bill do to deal with the situation often deployed by terrorists of previously planted devices? And it's hard to see how, without reaching into physical acts being required as counter-terrorist measures, how it would in fact impact. And I make that point mindful that just this weekend we marked the 40th anniversary of the Brighton, the Grand Hotel Brighton bombing, where one of the most audacious terrorist attacks to kill the cabinet of the United Kingdom was perfected by the planting of a bomb weeks before in that hotel. So we need to consider what is it that would help deal with that situation. That's why I'm a little bit concerned that in this bill, the Home Secretary said there will be no measures requiring physical steps to be taken. Well, if you have an hotel, if you have a leisure centre, if you have a large arena. And there is a deficiency which is observable by the SIA or whoever else in their CCTV coverage, as there was in Manchester. The terrorists were cute enough to pick out the blind spots on the CCTV. So is it not sensible, moving forward, if we're going to put in place protective measures, that they could include, should include, physical measures such as identifying the gaps in CCTV coverage, so that in the event of an outrage, there at least is the better prospect of bringing to justice those who perpetrated it, and perhaps acting as a deterrent. Because very often in fighting terrorism, deterrence is as important as anything else. And I do think it is our duty to ensure that that is so. I want to just touch a couple of other points in the bill. I note in clause 31 on civil liability, it says, nothing in this part confers a right of action in any civil proceedings in respect of any contravention of a requirement imposed on any person by this part. That causes me to question. Most of all our buildings are covered by the occupiers' liability legislation. The occupiers' liability legislation is premised on the duty of care of the occupier to their visitors. How can we say in clause 31 that if we're going to impose obligations in respect of taking steps to protect against the potential of terrorist attack, and those steps are not taken, how could we say in clause 31 that that will not create the basis of civil action? Surely that is an indicator and a contributor to the question of whether or not the duty of care was fulfilled to the visitor. So it does puzzle me why clause 31 is in those terms. The final thing I wanted to say is in respect of the SIA. We are giving a lot of powers to an organisation which frankly has not always covered itself in glory. I speak of my own party, United Kingdom, where we have had licences issued to some dubious characters by the SIA, and it's not beyond the wit of terrorists, and some of us have seen this, to set themselves up as so-called security firms and apply for licences. Do not ever fall into the trap of thinking that terrorists act by the rules we would act by. They wouldn't do that. Yes, they would. And the SIA, I think, has been found wanting. And in Northern Ireland, we recently had a case of gross overreach by the SIA, where they brought a prosecution in circumstances where the judge said it had to be stopped, it should never have been brought, and they spent £200,000. And they involved in that illegal searches of property. So the SIA is not a body which I think is the ready recipient for these extra powers. And I do worry that we are going to overburden it if they're going to do the job in the way it needs to be done. So I do say to the Minister, maybe the SIA is not the right regulatory body, because they already have a huge burden of work and have not always been successful in that what they do. We want to get this right, and we want to get this right by making sure that we, the elected representatives of this House, wanting to protect our constituents from the most hideous of things, namely terrorist attacks, do all that we reasonably can. And that means getting this legislation right. Thank you.
Luke Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will be brief. I'm rising to welcome this bill and the cross-party support for it that we have seen in this debate. 7 years ago, I worked in the education sector, and I worked with a group of trainee paramedics. And that group of trainee paramedics were deployed on that night in Manchester to the scene of the bombing. They were students, and they ran into the danger and into scenes that are scarcely seen outside of battlefields. And the support that they needed is the reason that I'm supporting this bill. I think it is the right thing to do. I commend the campaigning by Martin's family and by all others who have campaigned for justice for victims of terror. And I think that this is the right bill because I think the provisions within it are common sense. I think that the tiered approach is the right thing to ensure that there is not undue burden placed on small businesses. I think the legal duty on providers is a reasonable measure to make as well. There was another group of students from that particular university who sadly were affected by terror that same year, just weeks before. And they were referred to earlier in this debate by the former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Witham. One of them is a friend of mine called Travis Frayne, who I know members around the House will be familiar with. He's been campaigning passionately for victims of terror for years since his experience in that incident. He's carried out a survey of over 300 victims of terror, and in that survey he has found that 76% of those victims were either unable to access psychological treatment or rated it to be poor or abysmal. That's unacceptable, and that's why Travis has been calling for guarantees on minimum standards for access for psychological treatment and physiotherapy, as well as legal and financial assistance for victims of terror. He's also been calling, as the Right Honourable Lady referred to, for the publication of the review that was carried out internally within the Home Office, so that campaigners can campaign on those recommendations and ensure that they are put into action. So we know that there are further actions that need to happen, but this bill here is an important first step to move towards justice for the victims. It's a fitting tribute to the victims and to the families and to all those who ran towards the danger. Thank you.
Jim Channon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is indeed a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for her introduction today, for setting the scene so very well with the passion and the delivery and understanding. As I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no one in this chamber who could oppose this, because while does it go far enough, and some members have indicated some of the issues that may need to be addressed further down the line, but that's for the future. And to all those Right Honourable and Honourable members for their speeches today as well. Martin's Law, aptly named after one of those who tragically died, the carnage of the Manchester bombing, the tax upon the children and the young people. I don't think there's anyone, Madam Deputy Speaker, that hasn't shed a tear for that, and it lingers long. So thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for allowing me the opportunity to speak on this issue. As many will be aware in this chamber, the people of Northern Ireland have an unfortunate history of terrorism, which greatly influenced the way in which we lived our lives for many years. Our friend and member for North Altrincham indicated that in his contribution, and those are scars perhaps that we live with and probably will live with all our days, and they will never go away. We checked under our cars. I served as a part-time soldier for some 14.5 years. So checkpoints with soldiers or indeed RUC officers were the norm as they attempted to protect life and prevent acts of terror being wrought. We became conditioned, I think perhaps would be the way to say it, Madam Deputy Speaker, conditioned to ensuring that every and any event had a half eye towards terror events. I'm very pleased to see the Minister in this place, and he and I have been friends in this House for a long time, and I know he brings a personal knowledge from his own gallant service that the honourable member had, and we appreciate that very much. Put that on record for Hansard. My honourable friend, the member for North Antrim, referred to, and I want to just to give a couple of examples. After the indiscriminate shooting at a church hall at Dartley, during which gunmen murdered 3 elders welcoming their 70-strong congregation of men, women and children with no affiliation to any organisations whatsoever, or indeed with no other qualification other than that they be a Protestant. That's why they were murdered, simply by the IRA. The gunmen came into the hall, shooting and stopping only when the pastor cried out, and the gun jammed of the person who was there, and the gunman ran out to continue spraying the church with bullets from the outside with a semi-automatic rifle. So the question that I pose, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the House tonight is what will be done to ensure that those churches need the protection. The honourable member referred to schools as well. After that atrocity of the Dartley Hall murders, every church that I knew of across all of Northern Ireland ensured that there were men at the door and a plan of evacuation in place for creche and children's church facilities especially. Indeed, in child protection training in churches took place automatically after that event as well, and other faith buildings. I know that our evacuation procedures are standard to this very day from that event many years ago, as those who volunteer in the creche are given routes to send children to freedom should something go wrong. This is a lived experience, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Northern Ireland due to evil men who pushed an evil agenda and who destroyed the innocence of a nation but not its spirits. Nobody wants these horrors to be reality, but in Northern Ireland they have been. Our restaurants have a history of being targeted, and I give an example of Le Mans that used to be in my constituency but isn't now, having a napalm type bomb used, which not only took the lives of 12 people from the Coyle Club having dinner in a local hotel, but which horrifically burned and injured a further 30 people. One of those was Billy McDowell, who died just about 4 weeks ago. He was one of those injured. Since that time, our hotels have procedures in place that deal with that dreaded warning phone call. So we have experience. It's a horrific experience. They're not things that we like to boast about, because we're not boasting. We're just saying the things that we did voluntarily because it was the right thing to do. And this bill today, I think, brings us closer to that here as well. The people of Northern Ireland dealt with these horrors and the evil nature that drives them. The police force were so specialised that the RUC officers still train police officers around the world. I know that happens in the Balkans and Africa and the Middle East as well, and the Far East. Our expertise is one which I wish with all my heart we did not possess, but yet it was once rooted so deeply in our minds that someone leaving a shopping bag behind was a cause for evacuation of shopping centres. This is why I believe that whilst we cannot live in a lockdown mode, these basic considerations must be standard. Madam Deputy Speaker, the PSNI have expertise, they have knowledge, knowledge that is transferable skills should and must be part of the bill here tonight. So I'm hoping that the Minister, when he replies, and as I know he will in a very positive and helpful fashion, he always does, will tell us the things that we need to hear in this legislation and in this bill, and the goals that they're aiming for as well. Police must always, I say this very gently, police must always, Minister, must always be the last word in security. It can't be individuals, it can't be organisations, it must always be the police. We must ensure that the young kids like my granddaughters who do not have any experience of terrorism, this is something I thank God for, but are kept safe by those who understand that no matter how unlikely it is for an act of terrorism to be perpetrated against kids at a concert, such as those in Manchester that we referred to earlier, it is a possibility. Madam, I have 6 grandchildren. The 2 oldest girls, Katie and Mia, they don't know enough to suspiciously view bags or say, is there something unusual about that? I know others have said, and I say this very respectfully, Madam Deputy Speaker, not everybody sees the dangers. Not everybody sees what's suspicious. And children are innocent. and they should be able to have an innocent life. So when we look at these things and what the way forward, we need to know a better way. The people in charge of that facility need to beware for them, for the children. And whilst this is second nature for us in Northern Ireland, it must be the mindset of people UK-wide, and this is why I support the reasonable application of obligations that are before us here tonight. I have no desire, Madam Deputy Speaker, to put up the prices of tickets for events or meals in a large restaurant or bed nights in a resort or a spa. But the basic that could happen, what can we do if it does? And who will know what to do as a bare minimum at this stage? So can I perhaps just ask the Minister some questions, please, if I can. These are meant to be constructive, Madam Deputy Speaker. They always are. They're never meant to be anything other than to help this conversation and help build the legislation within this bill if it's possible. I'd ever like to understand what help and support will be offered to businesses to help them to come to terms, firstly, with what is reasonably expected, and further support with a cost-effective way of meeting obligations. That applies as much, by the way, to churches, it applies as much to schools as well, as it should, and all those things. We need to ensure that businesses aren't put off from expanding because they cannot meet costs. And that's why I would ask for the Minister to outline how we can be part of that conversation, to put in place the procedures to help keep people safe. Terror is something I wish was a thing of the past. But the shooting of DCI John Coyle in February 23 in Omagh, while he was coaching his own son's weekly football game, and shot last year, or the atrocity in Southport, when 3 young beautiful children were brutally murdered as well. This summer was a heartbreaking reminder that evil people are still at work, and we need to do all we can to stay safe and keep others safe with us. So tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this House, through this bill, through this potential legislation, we're taking a step in the right direction, and hopefully it will be, indeed it will be, to save lives and to stop terror attacks. Thank you so much.
Shadow Minister Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to start by closing my remarks by paying tribute to Fegan Murray and the Martin's Law campaign, survivors against terror, and all of the security partners, businesses, charities, local authorities and victims groups that have informed this bill to get it where we are today. And can I thank the Minister and the Home Secretary for their constructive tone in this debate and their offer to work with us to see that the bill's conclusion in this place happens quickly. It is a tragic turn of events that a terrible incident is a catalyst for change in the law, but I hope that the family of Martin Hett can take some pride in the legacy that Martin has left. We've had some very good contributions, particularly today, this evening, with 2 maiden speech. The first by the Honourable Lady for Tiverton and Minehead. It was lovely to see her family in the gallery, who were obviously very proud of her, and to hear of a number of local priorities that she will be working on behalf of her constituents. Even though in her maiden speech she outlined that she didn't have much in common with the Iron Lady whose birthday it was yesterday, I could see that there was an Iron Lady within her by that maiden speech, and therefore I look forward to hearing her future contributions in this place. And secondly, the maiden speech from the Honourable Gentleman, the member for the Forest of Dean. He paid a generous tribute to his predecessor Mark Harper, who did work hard for the Forest of Dean, and outlined how hard he will work for his constituents in this place. He challenged a number of members to say whether they also had TV shows based on their constituency and which was the most beautiful. And he asked whether anybody else could say that. I can, because in Hamble Valley, that BBC blockbuster Howard's Way was filmed. And we're particularly proud of that. And he should be rightly proud of his constituency going forward in this place. We had some other really important contributions. The first that I'd like to mention is from the Honourable Gentleman for the Altrincham and South West, who spoke as a member of the locality where the terrorist attack in Manchester happened, his constituency being in Greater Manchester, and spoke very passionately on behalf of his constituents and the lessons of the inquiry that was outlined in his speech. And I could tell that he has a deep care for his constituency and what happens going forward in this piece of legislation. And we pay tribute to him for that speech, added on to the Honourable Lady for Bolton North East, who spoke about the compassion and kindness that the people of Manchester have. I can say that occasionally, every other year, when the Conservatives go out for Tory party conference in Manchester, despite expectations, we are always welcomed very warmly in the bars and by the people of Manchester, and we send them our best wishes going forward. My right honourable friend, the member for Witham, quite rightly paid a tribute to Fegan Murray and to other charities that helped her and her wider campaign secure this change in the law. But she also mentioned the former Security Minister James Brokenshire, who I was briefly PPS to, who passed away 3 years ago. She is absolutely right to outline the work that he, in a very early way, did on this change in the law, and we all very much miss him in this place, as well as Sir David Ames, who was brutally murdered 3 years ago tomorrow. And of course, we also remember Joe Cox in this house as well. And my honourable friend, the member for Solihull West and Shirley, quite rightly outlined some concerns around some of the shortcomings, according to him, in this bill, particularly around organisations that have seasonal peaks. And I'd be interested to see how the Minister will outline how some of those challenges around those smaller businesses with seasonal peaks can be catered to in this legislation. But far too often our great country has come under attack, and all governments have worked tirelessly to protect the United Kingdom, and we believe that is why we must support this legislation in that aim this evening. And I'm proud of the work that the last government, including my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, did to bring in Martin's Law, and I think it is a measure of how much work was done by his family and other organisations that both I and the Minister can stand here today to show that this bill is needed and that we can broadly support the measures and the aims of this bill. And I congratulate once again, sincerely, the government for the fast-tracking of this bill and the way in which the Home Secretary opened this piece of legislation this evening. The aim of Martin's Law is to ensure premises are better prepared for terrorist attacks to help protect the public. And as I have said, we welcome this bill when we need to make sure the right balance is found between public protection and the requirements placed on businesses and community venues. As Neil Sharpley, Policy Chair of the Federation of Small Business, noted, this law will have an administrative impact on small businesses and the additional costs to them. Michael Kill, the CEO of the Nighttime Industry Association, said we must ensure that the balance between heightened security and practical implementation is carefully considered. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, outlined that although supportive of the bill, we do remain concerned at the level of regulation that we will impose on venues encapsulated in this legislation. And the impact assessment of the government outlines that 155,000 small businesses with capacity between 200 and 799 will have average costs of £330 per year, and larger venues will have average costs of £5,000 per year. So I would like assurances on the range of options that the Minister is looking at to mitigate this as much as possible, as well as the burdensome costs on charitable venues and religious venues that will have this level of capacity, as mentioned by both my honourable friends, the member for Solihull, and my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, and smaller venues in that case. I'd also like to raise some concerns around Clause 4 of the bill and the person responsible element of the legislation. While accepting that clear lines of accountability are necessary, can I ask what important safeguards will be in place for the responsible person should, in that horrible event, something tragically go wrong, either in terms of anonymity or support structures that can be placed around them, or a necessary line that the SIA uses its powers and investigatory functions in the most constructive way possible? I would like to finish, Madam Deputy Speaker. Oh, you've changed. I would like to thank Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to finish by thanking the government once again for continuing the important work on the bill. And I have said we will work with the government constructively throughout the passage of this bill and raise concerns should we have them, as we have this evening. But I welcome the Minister's approach once again and praise the family and supporters of Martin in their work to get this important part of the statute book changed. And as the official opposition, we look forward to supporting it in its passage in this place. Thank you very much.
Minister, Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to follow the Shadow Minister, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all honourable and right honourable members who've spoken in this debate. I will endeavour to address the themes of the arguments that have been put forth. But before turning to this, I'd like to place on record my thanks to the Home Affairs Select Committee for the scrutiny they provided of the draft bill last session. And I would also like to thank the opposition for the constructive approach they've taken to this bill, for the support that they've given today, and indeed for the work done by the previous government. Now, as many honourable members have rightly set out, keeping the country safe is the first duty of government. Just last week, the Director-General of MI5 set out in his threat update speech that the country is subject to the most interconnected threat environment that we have ever seen. The threat picture is complex, evolving and enduring, with terrorists choosing to attack a broad range of locations. It is not possible to predict where in the UK an attack might happen or the type of premises or event that could be impacted. But engagement with business indicates that preparedness and protective security in the counter-terrorism space often falls behind areas where there are long-established legal requirements, such as health and safety. Additionally, in recent years, inquests and inquiries into terror attacks have set out the need for a legal requirement, including monitored recommendation 4 in Volume 1 of the Manchester Arena Inquiry. The police, security services and other partners continue to do all they can to combat the terror threat, and we are immensely grateful to all those who work around the clock to counter threats and protect the safety of our country. The public are safer as a result of their efforts, and we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, many businesses and organisations already also do excellent work to improve their security and preparedness. However, the absence of legislative requirements means there is no consistency or consideration of outcomes achieved. That is what this bill, Martin's Law, seeks to achieve. It will improve protective security and organisational preparedness across the UK, thereby making us safer. Through the bill, qualifying premises and events should be better prepared to respond in the event of a terrorist attack. Those responsible for certain premises and events will be required to take steps to mitigate the impact of a terrorist attack and reduce harm in the event of a terrorist attack occurring. Additionally, certain larger premises and events will also have to take steps to reduce the vulnerability of premises to terrorist attacks. The public rightly deserve to feel safe when visiting public premises and attending events, and the government sees it as reasonable that in many locations appropriate and reasonably practical steps should be taken to protect staff and the public from the impact of terrorism. Now, of course, like everyone else has also done, I would like to take the opportunity to thank and to pay tribute to Fegan Murray, whose campaigning has been crucial in driving this bill forward. Her tireless work is an inspiration to us all. To have suffered such a tremendous loss and to still find the strength to campaign for change is extraordinary. And I know that I speak for all members of this House in saying that, Fegan, you are an inspiration. Turning now to the main points raised during today's debate. Firstly, I should say that we were privileged to hear two truly excellent maiden speeches. The member for Tiverton and Minehead and the member for Forest of Dean both spoke exceptionally well, did their constituents a real credit, and I know that the House will look forward to hearing much more from them as they draw upon the huge experience that they both bring to this place. I should also say that as this legislation progresses, we keep in our hearts all those who have lost their lives in terrorist attacks, including the late Sir David Amess and Joe Cox. They are gone, but their memory endures, as do our commitment to supporting their loved ones and the survivors who live with the scars of being caught up in terrorism, whether physical or psychological. And I firmly agree with the sentiments expressed by the Right Honourable Member for Witham in respect of the late James Brokenshire, who is much missed in this place. Happy to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Will he also join me in paying tribute to the late Ian Gow, the former Member of Parliament for Eastbourne, who was brutally assassinated in a terrorist attack in 1990, His shield is there, honouring his memory all year round, and I would invite the Minister and all members to share their tribute to him as well. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for that intervention, and yes, of course, I join with him, and I'm sure all members will want to pay tribute to the late Ian Gow, and I thank him for making that point. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Home Secretary asked about implementation, and following royal assent, there will be time to understand and, where necessary, act upon the new requirements before they come into force. We expect the implementation period to be at least 24 months to allow for the set-up of the regulator, and we will continue to engage and communicate with industry and other stakeholders during this period, including in the live music sector, to ensure that sufficient time for those responsible for premises and events in scope to understand their new obligations and to plan and to prepare. A robust monitoring and evaluation plan is also in place to measure the bill's effectiveness following implementation, and the government will keep the bill's measures under review and have the powers needed to adjust the regime if necessary. Now, several members asked about the proportionality of the standard tier, and the government is extremely mindful that many premises and events continue to face the challenge of rising costs. The bill seeks to achieve public protection outcomes whilst avoiding undue burden on business and other organisations. And in the standard tier, the focus is on having procedures that are intended to be simple and low cost. There will be no requirement to put in place any physical measures. Happy to give way.
Just for giving way. Many of my constituents in Rochdale warmly welcome this bill, particularly given that many of them were in the Manchester Arena on that dark day in 2017. I'd like to suggest, though, that many small music venues do worry about the proportionality of this bill. Does he want to give them reassurance that actually the voluntary scheme in Manchester has worked well so far, and that actually this revised version of the bill will reduce the costs that were anticipated before?
Minister.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful to him as a Greater Manchester MP for that intervention, and he makes an important point. I think it is worth saying in response that the feedback that we've had from businesses in the Greater Manchester area has been incredibly positive to date. So whilst we are incredibly mindful of the potential burdens on business, we've consulted, we've worked very closely with the sector, and we will continue to listen carefully to the concerns that they may wish to raise. I'm going to make a bit of progress. I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman in a moment, but I am very conscious that time is against me, and Madam Deputy Speaker is looking intently at me. I want to pick up on the important points that the Right Honourable Member for Witham. She made a number of important points, not least the primary role of the SIA that will be to provide advice, guidance and support to those responsible to enable them to meet their obligations. The bill also gives the SIA the enforcement and investigation powers needed. These are modelled on those of other similar inspection regimes, which will allow an inspector to enter premises, interview staff, gather the information they need and assess the level of compliance. In the most serious or persistent of instances, criminal sanctions will be available. The Right Honourable Lady also asked for an update on our work to support the victims of terrorism. And she referenced rightly the good work of Travis Frayne, who I also have had the privilege of meeting, to discuss these important issues, including that of memorialisation. She did raise a number of important points, and I will commit to write to her specifically on this point, but also on the other points that she raised. But she should be assured, as should the whole House, of this government's commitment to supporting the victims of terrorism. Now, the Honourable Member for Altrincham and Sale West, Greater Manchester MP, spoke powerfully about the impact of the Manchester attack, and I fully agree with everything he said, as I did with the contribution made by the Honourable Member for Bolton North East. The Honourable Member for Hazel Grove spoke very movingly about Minehead and eloquently paid tribute to the solidarity, resilience and resolve of the people of Greater Manchester. I can also assure her and the House that dedicated, easy-to-follow guidance and support will be provided for duty holders to ensure that those in scope have the required information on what to do and how best to do it. This will include local authorities, and as raised by the Honourable Members for Solihull, West and Shirley and North Cornwall respectively, will also include volunteers. Now, the Honourable Member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark asked about planning processes. I made a particular note about the point he made around bollards. And I can assure him that we will consider with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government and planning leads in the devolved governments how security considerations are referenced and achieved through the planning regimes and guidance in light of the provisions of the bill. The Honourable Member for Solihull West and Shirley, I think, made a number of really important and pertinent points. He rightly said that protection and safety of the public is paramount, but he did raise a number of points around the impact on smaller premises and the changing nature of the threat, and I can give him the assurances that he sought. The Honourable Member for Dudley, I think, made a number of very useful points, not least in terms of seeking to strike the right balance between security and the impact on business. And the Honourable Member for North Cornwall rightly reflected his own constituency experience and spoke about rural venues and smaller premises and the penalties. He also, and I'm very grateful for him doing it, mentioned Brendan Cox, and I think it is absolutely right to reference the very significant contribution that Brendan Cox has made to this process. The Honourable Member for Edinburgh East and Musselburgh made a really important point about Edinburgh. Edinburgh is known as a great city that knows how to host events, and I'm particularly pleased to hear that their city welcomes this legislation, and of course we will want to work very closely with colleagues in Scotland elsewhere to ensure the successful implementation of this legislation. The Honourable Member for North Antrim, I think, did make a number of important points, not least in terms around ensuring that we work together to defeat terrorism, but he also raised important points about smaller premises and the SIA. I'm happy to discuss those points with him further, but I can say to him that the enhanced duty requirements will not apply to premises used for childcare or primary or secondary or further education, but I'm happy to discuss these matters further with him. The Honourable Member for Middlesbrough South, East and Cleveland also mentioned Travis Frayne, and I'm grateful for him for doing so, and I join with him in paying tribute to the work that Travis has done. He has been an inspirational campaigner, and we will want to continue to work closely with him in the future. The Honourable Member for Strangford, as he always does, draws very sensibly on his experience of Northern Ireland from a terrorism perspective. His contribution is always appreciated. He did raise a number of specific points, and I will endeavour to come back to him by letter in order to give him clarity. Happy to give way.
And the Minister's always very kind. I knew he would say yes to me eventually. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just ask a minute? You haven't commented yet on churches. Could I ask maybe that you would give us some idea what your thoughts are there? I mentioned in my contribution the fact that the churches all, after the Dartley Hall massacre, that they took precautions right across all of Northern Ireland and all churches to do those things. I mean, I think every person needs to be safety conscious. That's the role that every person in church took upon themselves to do. So, again, a kind question to the Minister. Thank you.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for raising the point about churches. So all places of worship will be included as part of the standard tier. We recognise the unique and hugely important contribution that they make, and we've looked very closely at how we can ensure that this legislation will provide the appropriate protections for those places of worship. But again, very happy to discuss it further with him should he wish to do so. Madam Deputy Speaker, the provisions of this bill have been very carefully designed to strike the right balance between public protection and avoiding undue burdens on premises and events. They are simple, common sense steps which will bolster the UK's preparedness for and protection from terrorism. Before I finish, I would again like to take the opportunity to reiterate thanks, I'm sure, on behalf of the whole House to Figen Murray. To have gone through what she has and still work so tirelessly for change is both humbling and inspiring. As Figen has said, it's time to get this done, and she's right. Madam Deputy Speaker, security is the foundation upon which everything else is built. For this government, nothing will matter more. And with that, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Money resolution to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.